Stephen Hicks, great to see you, and thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. So, what's interesting is right before we got on this call, I actually did a quick search. I plugged in two search terms into my engine, DEI and medicine, and up popped dozens and dozens of results of various institutions, some government, some non-government, all very prestigious institutions who all have DEI offices and
Mm,
DEI professionals very hard at work at something called achieving some form of justice, institutional sanctioned justice, or expert sanctioned justice. And what
yeah.
was interesting for me to see that I've been following this trend for quite some time is that they use very flowery, very seductive language. And a
Mm,
lot of people were very drawn to these ideas and kind of hop on board, got on the bandwagon. But what is interesting when you really, if we go by the edict of judging someone by the fruit of their labor, the fruit ultimately appears to be divisive.
mm,
And the other effect or the other bottom line of some of these offices and those activists on the ground is that they seem to be accumulating more power and more directorship of the institutions that they inhabit. And then on the other end of this, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of benefit for when we talk about the divisive language. They seem to be dividing people into these arbitrarily assigned categories, some of which they truly deeply care about, and some of which they think need to kind of clear the way for the others. And there
mm,
doesn't seem to be a whole lot to show for the so-called groups of people that they seem to care about.
yeah.
So I'm wondering if you could shed some light on what are we dealing with and what
Mm,
are the roots of this movement?
yeah. Well, yeah, that's a lot packed into your very good summary there. And yeah, medicine is one of the last holdouts, so to speak, where a rational, individualistic philosophy came to dominate the movement and has accomplished wonderful things in the modern era over the last course of 2 centuries, 3 centuries or so. But what has happened, if we take the long view, is that there has been a philosophical counter revolution going on at the same time for the last 2 to 3 centuries or so, but only in the last 50 years has it achieved traction. And what you are seeing in medicine and starting to get into some of the other technical fields, engineering, even the hard sciences and so forth, as a result of a philosophical counter revolution. Now, there's a lot of unpacking that needs to be based in there. If we ask what has made medicine so successful in the modern world, the philosophical basis for that was a commitment to reason and rationality. The idea that through empiricism, through scientific method, through a passionate, but at the same time dispassionate application of logic, evidence, and its application to human beings, we can figure out what actually causes health, what causes various sorts of diseases. We can think like engineers think about how to improve the system, how to fix the system when it gets broken. All of that was applied to human beings over the course of many generations, and the results were a much lessening of pain, better nutrition, better surgery, longer life expectancy, and so on. Now, all of that, though, has been under assault. That's strong language, but it's actually putting it mildly. It's been under assault by philosophical systems that are committed to skepticism at a minimum, that reason is not competent, that science is just another story, that logic is ultimately impotent. And to the extent that that has been successful first in philosophy and then in conjoining fields, it has hollowed out in the minds of many intellectuals and academics their commitment to reason and the scientific method. And once that has happened, then that vacuum, so to speak, was filled by all sorts of irrationalist movements that are committed to various sorts of other agendas. And there's lots of these other agendas that are now competing for that vacuum space, but it's been hollowed out by a certain kind of skepticism. Now, one sort of form you will see this is people who will argue that, and you've probably heard this one, that logic is just a Eurocentric invention, right? Or right, there is male reason versus female something or other. And so what was formerly, for example, confined to certain kinds of feminism or certain kinds of racial thinking, arguing that different races have different ways of thinking and so forth, that was in certain departments and certain programs in universities, nonetheless came to have great cachet and great institutional power. And then when they got that institutional power, then they started to apply that outside of their areas into other fields, in the social sciences, in the hard sciences, and then into the professional schools. So that's one part of the story. And anytime you hear one side of the argument saying, look, evidence-based medicine, for example, is fundamental. If you hear any sort of a criticism of that, right, or that the idea of reason is universal to the species, and that is criticized for being sexist or for being racist from a certain perspective, you're listening to people who have bought into that other philosophical counter-revolution. And that's one part of the story. There's two or three other parts of the story, but that's the most fundamental one, the attack on reason, logic, scientific method that has been very successful and is marching its way through.
Yes, and the attack of reason, I think if we, correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the tenets of the attack on reason started with Kant, I believe.
Well, in my view, it didn't start with Kant, but I think Kant is the most sophisticated form of the attack on reason, and it's the one that has had the most staying power. Mm-hmm. And that, at least when you look at formal academic philosophy and the way it has worked itself out since Kant, that all of the various anti-reason movements and explicitly irrationalist movements will use fundamentally Kantian arguments at their basis.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So if I recall from your writings, you mentioned that Kant was sort of the usher of postmodernism, and one of the things that he really excluded or dismissed was objectivity versus subjectivity. Is that part of this?
That's right. Yes. Yeah. So the idea of reason and evidence is to say the world is the way it is. And so cognitively, our fundamental commitment should be to identifying facts for what they are, not based on tradition, not based on our feelings, not based on our wishful thinking, a fundamental respect for facts. But if you come to be committed by skeptical arguments that say, oh, we can't know facts, right? That facts in some sense are just subjectively constructed, or they are emotional wishful thinking, or they are conditioned into us. What we think is a fact is just something conditioned into us by our group membership. And so then you think objectivity is a myth. Then you're not going to try to be objective anymore. And to the extent that that argument has traction, then people will try to fit their personal agendas or their group's agendas in place of objectivity. So a commitment to objectivity has been one of the great achievements in modern medicine, and that has what has been attacked in various forms since Kant.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's so interesting, and so obviously this this started way before Kant, but Kant, you said, was one of the main levers, if you will, to usher this approach in.
Yeah, skeptical arguments have been around for forever. It's just that Kant has the most sophisticated of the skeptical arguments that no one is, or not no one, but most people have not been able to think outside of since Kant.
I see. And what makes Kant so special, if we can look at the mechanics of what he was arguing for? How did he actually get this thing in? Because it's quite mind-boggling to see it in the field and to see it in the world acting quite. I mean, ultimately, I think unsustainably, but riding on the coattails of Western civilization and the Enlightenment movement, and still undermining it while it's doing that.
Yeah. Well, there are lots of variations that are possible. So if you think, for example, of in the early modern world, the great battles between traditional forms of religion and the new sciences that were coming along. And the new sciences are coming along and saying we need to look at reality and work our way up to abstract theories, put things to experimental tests, and so on. But at the same time, you have a large number of people who are committed to a belief system that they think is true and important and gives their lives meaning, but they don't have good evidence for it. They can't do experiments that prove it, but nonetheless, they want to believe in that traditional religious belief system. And so what you find them explicitly doing is trying to find ways to weaken the case for reason and scientific method. So they will attack the senses as illusory, or you can't tell the difference between a dream state and an actual waking state, or that that logic has these problems, or that everything is semantics in various ways. So if you can undercut reason in all of these forms, then that leaves it makes it seem more legitimate for you to say, well, I'm just going to accept on faith what I want to believe on faith, and you can't tell me that I'm wrong because reason has been undercut. And we know that's a very common move psychologically for people who want to preserve their religious faith in the face of a more prestigious scientific approach. Now, the same thing, though, happens in other domains. There are lots of people who will be committed to a political doctrine. And we know they get fired up by a political doctrine. And then you start coming after them with facts, with evidence, with logic, with charts, with statistics, and so forth, that undercuts their commitment to their political doctrine. And rather than saying, oh, I guess I need to change my mind about this political doctrine, they will then use the exact same kind of arguments. They want to believe in their politics so badly that they are willing to say, oh, well, that's just evidence. That's just your logic. That's just, some group, and then mount an ad hominem attack against that group that's coming forth with that argument. But it's the same psychological mechanism. The same thing occurs with not with respect to political doctrines, but with respect to people who are committed to a racial or an ethnic identity. And this is going to be the one that brings us closer to DEI, which is just a trendy set of labels for an old-fashioned movement. But suppose you are first and foremost someone who says, my identity and my meaning is is based on a commitment to my racial identity, or the awesomeness of my ethnic group. And I first and foremost think of myself as a member of that group. And then you start looking at the facts of history, and you find out that maybe your racial group has not prevailed, or that other racial groups, from your perspective, have done better. And they have come up with all of these things like science and technology and becoming rich and so forth. And that causes you to feel inferior from your racial group's perspective or from your ethnic group's perspective. But rather than saying, okay, I guess what my racial and ethnic group should do is try to learn from these other groups so that we can improve our group's situation, you will then say, I don't want to think that my ethnic group has any weakness, right, or problems, because my identity is based on believing in the superiority and awesomeness of my racial and ethnic group. And so what you want to do is find some way not to feel inferior and to commit yourself still to your racial and ethnic identity. But then you have to attack that which people say made the competitor racial and ethnic groups superior or seemingly superior. And if it's been science, if it's been their medicine, if it's been their philosophy, then you will try to find some way to attack that. And then you will then say, well, our racial methods or our ethnic methods are still superior, but in some non-rational, non-logical, non-Western, non-Eurocentric way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that sounds a lot like, just as an aside, it sounds a lot like Lysenkoism, where they basically superimposed Marxist ideology on science. You kind of just pepper it a little bit and tweak it to fit your ideology.
No, that's exactly right. So they recognize that some form of evolutionary theory has to be true. But in that case, the case of Lysenko, what they want to argue is that it is possible to change human beings, how they behave and how they act, and through that alter the evolutionary process. That fits with your commitment to a kind of Marxist philosophy. So it's your philosophy that is first, and then you try to interpret a version of a scientific theory that will best fit your prior commitment to a philosophy. So it's that prior commitment that you're not willing to question, that you're not willing to change. That's the root problem. And that's a fundamentally, or that fundamentally rather is someone who is not rational, someone who is not empirical.
Yes, yes. And what struck me about all this, this movement in its entirety, and this, as you mentioned earlier, this focuses on many different identity groups. It seems like whatever stuck to the wall that those movements kind of went with. I think they tried different identity groups down the road, and whatever really sparked the most emotion and fervor they went along with. This whole thing looks like almost like a fundamental religious movement. I mean, almost a cult. I mean, there's no real leader to it. I guess there are leaders to smaller Soviets or smaller committees of the cult, but it seems to be a form of a leaderless, godless cult. That I was wondering what your take on that.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I think there are many variations on it. You'll find some, of course, that are emphasizing gender identities, right? And their commitment to gender issues, it requires them to attack certain sorts of biological realities about sex. Others are more committed to racial issues, not so much to gender issues, or they're committed to various sorts of ethnic identities as well. And so what you will then find is a lot of variations on a core set of themes, but those themes were established by people who are now dead, right? In the previous generation, it's now being applied in lots of different ways. And so you don't have one overall movement leader for the whole shebang. But there's another element that's built into this, that part of what made modernity so successful is the idea of the individual. And it's tied to the notion of reason, the idea that reasoning is something that happens in an individual's mind. That's not a matter that you're part of a group or part of a collective and that there's groupthink, or that you're part of a tradition and you just inherit that tradition's beliefs and carry them on. Part and parcel of it was that every individual needs to think for himself, for herself, and then apply the results of his or her thinking to their own life. So that's a big responsibility for many individuals. It's also a big freedom for people. And part and parcel of the success of the scientific method has been precisely individuals who are willing to stand up and challenge the status quo and to introduce new ideas and new innovations and so forth. So the individualism of the modern world has been very important. But we do know that there are many people who either don't like the individualistic approach, it's too much responsibility for them, too much work for them. And so there is a shortcut that I will get a sense of meaning and identity in my life just by merging myself with a certain group. And that I will then feel that I have a meaning in my life, or perhaps even that I am superior and significant in my life because I am a part of this group. And that then means I've got a recipe for what I'm supposed to believe, how I'm supposed to behave. And I've got a whole bunch of other people whom I can rely upon instead of what seems to be that harsh thing from individualism that I have to ultimately rely on myself. So you have a lot of people then who want to affirm their racial identity, and that's more important to them than their individual identity, or their ethnic identity, and that's more important to them than their individual identity, or being a member of a certain political group or a certain political religious group and so forth. So that groupism, or what we call more technically collectivism, is another important part of what we are facing right now. And so what they are willing to do is set aside concern for the individual in order to meet certain group advancement targets. And that, of course, is going to have big implications for not only how you function as an individual doctor, Do you think for yourself and judge individual cases on their own merits? Do you challenge? Or have you been taught that you need to go along with the group, whatever the right group is? It also then means when you are treating patients or doing an experiment, you stop looking at individuals so much, and you're looking for group targets, whatever those group targets happen to be. And that fundamentally takes medicine in a very different direction.
Yeah, yes, it does. And what's interesting is really departure from individualism and really self or personal agency, and really relinquishing that to some form of a hive mind or a group. And all these movements appear to be the progressive kind of movements appear to have collectivism at their core,
Yeah.
and really that relinquishment or that rejection of individualism. It's almost a dirty word. And in fact, when people who they purport to belong to certain categories of arbitrarily assigned signs or characteristics that they seem to care about, when those people stray from the course, they seem to be treated pretty harshly
That's right. That's right.
by people belonging to this group.
That's right. Yeah, you shall not think for yourself. You shall not deviate from the group. So it's a new kind of conformism that is enforced on the dissenting individuals, rather than the modernist view, which is that you judge individuals on their own merits. And you would kind of expect that individuals who are thinking for themselves are going to have differences of opinion, and that they should try to resolve those differences by reason. And ultimately, you leave it up to individuals to make up their own mind and go their own way if you can't reach any sort of agreement. But all of that then gets put by the by if you think individuals need to conform to their group identity. And if you have someone who seems to be a dissenter, you're not going to try to reason them into conformity. Instead, you're going to use more forceful authoritarian methods to get them to remain part of the group.
Right, right. And what a lot of it, I think we've been kind of dancing around this. A lot of what's happening is really a struggle for power, for taking possession of the control levers of the institutions,
Yeah.
and executing whatever it is that they sanctioned as they call it justice. Really, it's policy on the ground, what people ought to do, what sort of practices they ought to follow. And I'm wondering, and maybe you could shed some light on this, is so there are various levels to this, obviously, of people on the ground, more sort of grassroots activist level, and then there as the scheme builds up or the pyramid builds up, what do you think is how much awareness do you think is there amongst people at work at this, to usurping power, or really exacting what they in their utopian vision see as justice, which is a very seductive thing, very beautiful thing on its surface until you start poking at it. So what do you think is power versus the utopian vision, the naive maybe utopian vision?
Yeah, I think anytime you get to a broad cultural movement, you're always going to have both of those who are operative. You have those who are more strategic and more informed, and they're the ones who formulate the terminologies that are going to be used and the rhetorical strategies that are going to be used. And they are always the ones who are setting the tone and the pace and the tactics that are going to be used. And those ones typically are not true believers in any utopian, particularly in the case of DEI. They are not utopians anymore. It is about power, but they have learned linguistic and rhetorical methods to disguise, because they can't just come out and say, we are racist, anti-individualist, anti-collectivist. We just want power against various other groups that we see as our enemies. They recognize that they need to cover that with nice sounding words. And this is why, when they start talking about justice, they expect that you are going to automatically start thinking they mean something by justice. And it's not until you investigate carefully that you say, wait a minute, what they mean by justice seems to be something completely different, right? Or diversity, and you say, oh, diversity, and you start thinking diversity means this, that, and the other thing, and then you investigate more closely and you say, oh, no, they seem to be using diversity in a very different way, or equity or inclusion and so forth. So for the intellectual leaders of the movement, they are very explicit when you read their books and you read what's going on in the academic journals when they are talking amongst themselves, that they know what they are doing. They are saying, look, in the last generation, we lost certain debates, we lost certain policy battles that we fought. So all of the language that we used in that debate has now come to seem tired and discredited. We need to do the same strategy and fight for the same goals, but we need a new vocabulary for this next generation. And so they will just make up words that they know sound good to most people in our culture, and try those out in the cultural wars, so to speak. But that's at the strategic level. Now, the average person who is initially attracted to this movement, you think of college students, right, or just ordinary well-meaning citizens who are concerned with issues of equality and racial injustice, and there really are issues of equality and issues of racial injustice. And so these are well-meaning people, and they've got some energy, and they think of themselves as idealistic. They want to make the world a better place. They can be captured quite easily, and then their energy directed in the way that the strategists want the energy rather to be directed for the movement to go. So we see this in one very good example of this is just to say that the affirmative action debates that we had starting in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. Now, we could go into the arguments back and forth, but there were people who were saying, look, we need to learn, as Martin Luther King does, Jr. said, to treat people as individuals, judge them by their character, judge them by their merit. And what we want to do is to get rid of all double standards in the law and double standards in how we treat people, so that people who are accomplished individuals of all races can succeed or not according to their abilities in their society. So we'll have a metaphorically colorblind society, by which it just means we're not going to take racial colors into account. We're going to judge people on the basis of other things. And that's a very individualistic, reason-based approach to dealing with race issues. We will judge people rationally according to their actual merits. Now, the early part of the affirmative action opposition was then saying, no, we don't think that that's going to work. Racial attitudes are too deep. Instead, we need to fight fire with fire, or we need to fight the remaining elements of racism with some sorts of other racism. And they will intentionally then collectivize the concept of race. We're not going to look at individuals. We're going to put people in racial groups and have various sorts of quotas to try to achieve equality according to racial group representation and proportion in the population. So you have a collectivist approach and one more individualistic approach. And you could argue in the 1950s and 60s that both of them were committed to achieving racial justice and racial equality right back then. But we argued about that for 20 years. We experimented with some affirmative action programs. We put them through all sorts of legal test cases all the way up to the Supreme Court. By the time we got to the 1990s, just speak from a North American context, basically all Americans, or the vast majority of Americans, are saying, no, we want people to be individualistic. We don't want affirmative action programs. And the courts had by and large agreed that we're not going to do affirmative action, that it violates the 14th Amendment, the 13th Amendment. It's not individualistic. It involves a double standard for different racial groups and so forth. So by the 1990s then, that debate was over. Now, did the people, though, who are anti-individualistic, who think that we really are a racist society through and through, do you think that the people who were committed to racial pride for whatever their racial group was, and who were collectivist in their psychology, that they accepted that the affirmative action debate was over and just went away? And the answer is no, obviously not. You see them talking in the wake of the various Supreme Court decisions in the academic journals. They become cynical, they become jaded, they work out a new set of terminologies. We can't talk about affirmative action anymore. We can't talk about racial quotas anymore. Instead, we are going to talk about equity. We are going to talk about diversity. We're going to talk about inclusion, but it's exactly the same kinds of arguments, just repackaged with this new set of labels. But there was an additional level of cynicism at that point, because what they said was, it's not that we had this debate over affirmative action and we lost the debate for rational reasons, and that this was a good faith debate. The lesson they learn is racism is so bad in this society that the courts have been bought and acquired by, so to speak, our racial enemies. And so we have to just stop thinking that we have legal recourse, that we can be decent and have civil conversation with people. It's a power struggle, and our race needs to get dirtier and more nasty in the debate and in our activists if we're going to be successful on behalf of our groups. So they become more cynical and more naked power activists, but at the same time, they're coming up with a new rhetorical strategy using different language in order to be successful in the culture wars.
So this was actually a deliberate and intentional discussion.
Oh yeah, yeah, that's right. And so
if you will.
we're using affirmative action issues and racial examples as one example, but you see, for example, the founding of what we now call critical race theory. It was precisely in the 1990s. Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, Richard Delgado, and others. They are crushed and disappointed as a result of what has been happening in their then relatively young lives. And they say, look, we need a new strategy, we need a new language, and it has to be more cynical, more jaded, more naked power when we can get away with it, but a better rhetorical strategy to fool people about what we are up to for the foreseeable future. So that was worked out all in the 1990s, the first decade of the 2000s, and then it was a successful intellectual and activist strategy inside the universities. That's what bursts out in the 2010s, in the teens, and then suddenly is aware, everybody starts to be aware, wow, this is, where did this come from? And then we see it march through the institutions, and here we are still in the relatively early 2020s, and for the last 8 to 10 years or so, we've been aware that we have a real battle on our hands.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And this seems intuitively, maybe I'm wrong here, it seems very Hegelian in the sense that it seems to be that synthesis, that marriage between two seemingly opposing concepts that kind of just is used to advance to the final goal, or wherever it is that they're trying to drive us to.
Yeah, well, I don't think it's Hegelian. I don't actually think Hegel's philosophy explains very much, but I know what you're trying to get at, right? So what you're saying is, really, this is what they are about. It's a kind of naked power politics at work. And when we're dealing with these people, they can be very nasty. And when they get in power, they are ruthless with dealing with anybody in their own group who seems to be at a center and anybody who is in the racial out group. And so that would be the thesis, so to speak, to use the Hegelian language. At the same time, they have this very effective rhetorical strategy where they are using what seem to be nice words, right? They're talking about diversity and equity and inclusion and justice and so forth. But at the same time, they're not committed to that. So there is a kind of contradiction right at work there. But I think what's actually going on is it's better to say that they are Machiavellian, going back to Niccolo Machiavelli, the political philosopher, who would say, really, what you need to do is recognize that everything is a power struggle, and you are going to succeed in the power struggle by any tactics, but of course, what you can't do is tell everybody exactly what your strategy is. You always have to have a nice cover story to get the less educated and the people who are not really paying attention to go along with you. So it's a kind of use of language and abuse of language for naked political politics. Or another analogy is to say that there's a difference between lawyers who go into a courtroom and they really believe that it's about the evidence, it's about trying to find the truth so that we can do justice, and they are true believers in the process of going through the legal system, versus those lawyers who are very cynical, who go into the courtroom and say, really, it's just a battle and it's all about winning, and I will use any rhetorical tactic necessary, including lying if I can get away with it, in order to pull the wool over the jury's eyes or pull a fast one that the judge isn't going to notice, because it's not really about truth, it's about winning. It's not really about justice, it's about power.
Speaking of another tool that we hit upon in our preliminary discussion, there seems to be a monopolization of morality by the people involved in this movement. It's almost axiomatic or a matter of faith that morality or justice is on their side. And it seems to be pretty much across the board. The high moral ground is with whomever is engaged in the implementation of those policies.
Right. Yeah.
And I'm wondering, first of all, well, it seems that would be a very useful tool, especially in Western society where morality is sort of in the water and in the air. That's the underpinning of society, are leaning heavily on morality. So
Yep.
you can definitely make use of that to usurp power. But I'm also wondering, is there a specific analysis or language that led up to this where they basically rejected morality as in the Judeo-Christian sense, and what led to that, and how is that really a workable tool for them to use in the world? And
yeah. No, I think that's a very perceptive remark. I think certainly in the movement, morality is the most important asset, right, that they have. But everything in morality is controversial. And what we have had in, broadly speaking, Western civilization, I think is actually becoming global civilization, but started in Western civilization, always was at least a three-way battle over what morality is and should be about. Now, just to put it in brief form, when we talk about the debate between individualism and collectivism, that's an aspect of a moral battle. Do you think individuals, first and foremost, are the moral unit of value, that it's all about the individual's life? And so we think individual life is precious. And then when we are talking in a more political context, we'll say that individuals should have rights to their own life, their own liberty, their own pursuit of happiness, and that individuals need to be self-responsible and take control of their own lives. All of that is a moral code that has been extraordinarily influential initially in Western civilization, and then it's been spreading around the world. But there have been also in Western civilization moral codes that are not only not individualistic, but anti-individualistic. Some of them more traditional, right? You belong to your family. It's the family collective that is the most important thing. And so if you think, for example, and it sounds a little bit old-fashioned, where it used to be commonplace, if you're the father, you assume that your daughter kind of belongs to the family, and you can marry her off to whomever you want. And if she says, but I don't love that guy, it's not going to make me happy, that's kind of an irrelevant individualistic concern. What's more important is what's good for the family, right? Or that sons have certain pre-assigned obligations depending on birth order about what they are supposed to do with their lives. Now, there are other forms of that, though, that will say that you don't necessarily belong first and foremost to your family, but you are a servant of your nation. You belong to your society, and you have an obligation to serve your society. And for example, if your society wants to draft you and send you off to war, whether you agree with that war or agree with the draft or not, that's irrelevant. You belong to the society and you have an obligation to serve your society in whatever form you want. Or, though they're getting closer to the ones that are more current now, you belong to your racial group and you have an obligation to think as other members of your race do and serve your race, not to be a race traitor and go off and do various other sorts of things. And that morality also has been strongly powerful in Western civilization. There are religious forms that say you should not be concerned with your pursuit of happiness. You should see yourself as a servant, merely as a tool, say, of God or the gods, to do your duty, whether it makes you happy or not, to sacrifice yourself, as served. So all of that is extraordinarily controversial. And then, of course, there's been a third form of morality that says there is no such thing, so to speak, as virtue and dignity and ideals. Instead, everything just is power and power struggle. And there's no such thing as honesty. Nice guys finish last. Justice is a myth. It's just words that people use to try to, con you, to put you to sleep so they can stick the knife in your back. It's a brutal dog eat dog kind of world. And that is a kind of moral code as well. And it's also been very powerful in Western civilization. So that's a somewhat potted, very short version of at least a three-way battle. But whichever morality has the high ground, whichever one most people in a given generation think is the right kind of moral code, that one is going to have huge implications for cultural practices and for political practices. And that's what we are facing right now. Do you think it is a fundamentally moral virtue for people to be rational and pay attention to the evidence and being willing to change their minds, or not? Do you think it's fundamentally moral on that same issue for people to go along with their racial group and to adopt the belief system of their racial group or their ethnic group or whatever it is? Because that's a very different fundamental approach. Do you think it's moral fundamentally to treat others as individuals, to judge them according to their character, and that anything else is immoral if you are not doing that? Or do you think it's moral, first and foremost, to have a kind of racial or tribal or ethnic allegiance and to see members of different races and different ethnicities as part of the out group? And if you try to be nice to individuals in that out group, you are being a traitor or disloyal to your own collective group. That's another aspect of that same moral battle. So we are in the midst of a great battle for the moral high ground right now.
Yes. And along with the rejection of morality as we knew it in classic American or Western society, there's also a rejection of redemption and forgiveness. And I'm wondering if that's part of it, alongside it, if we look at this arbitrary assignment of identity groups to people, these are things that one cannot get out of. Generally, the identities that these people use to assert their agendas are not really things you can get out of. And those are things that are unforgivable sins, appear to be, at least. And we were talking about morality. It appears to be almost an original sin for whoever belongs to the bad group. And that is completely irredeemable.
That's exactly right. And that's part and parcel of the rejection of individualism, particularly individual agency. So if you think of the notion of redemption, the notion of redemption as it has worked its way out in the Western tradition is you as an individual did something bad. And the first step is to recognize that you were the agent that did the bad. And so it's a self-reflective, I did it, I take ownership from it, and I recognize my guilt. Then I, as an agent, take steps to try to rectify the damage that was done. And I take steps to reform my character so that I will not do that same sort of thing again. And if it's necessary in a public way, I provide enough evidence to other people that I have changed and have made restitution so that I can be redeemed in their eyes as well as my own eyes, and then hopefully forgiven. Now, what happens, though, is if you take any notion of individuality away and individual agency, that whole story doesn't make sense anymore. If your view is that people are more or less interdependent or interchangeable units that are born into certain groups and who they are is conditioned by their group membership, well, you're not going to change how that whole group thinks and acts and behaves and so forth. And if you decide that they are the enemy as a group, anything that the individual does is never going to be enough to overcome everything that you think that group has done that is wrong. That person is just bad for being a part of the out group, and nothing they can do can get rid of that badness. Also, it's part and parcel of the rejection of rationality, because if you think my group and your group have had some conflicts in the past, let's sit down rationally and try to find work out a compromise or to wipe the slate clean going forward. If you don't think that people are basically rational, that whole approach is going to be a non-starter for you. And once the reason goes, all you're going to be able to do is just consign people to the fiery pits of hell in whatever form that can take, whether religious or secular.
Right, right. And so judging by just looking back at the very checkered history of the 20th century, I think it's safe to say that all collectivist movements that actually rose to power exacted pretty much the same. Well, there's obviously various linguistic variations and maybe nuances in the execution, but they pretty much wound up in the same place, and that is mass slavery, mass extermination and murder of people. And it's a very worrisome trend to see that crawling and advancing through the institutions. But we're also aware that there is a counter movement, and there are many people who are actually standing up to this and raising objections. And I think it in actually a very learned and informed way from what I've seen out there. And I'm wondering, where do you see this going, and what are some of the counter movements or counter arguments that you've seen come up that really have been successful against this?
Well, I also am encouraged by you. I started thinking about these issues back in the 1990s after I finished grad school. My grad school work was quite narrow and technical in epistemology, philosophy of science, history of medicine. I did a lot of that as well. And so I didn't start paying attention to a lot of what is now wokeism, right, and the DEI movement and so forth until the 1990s. And so it was somewhat dispiriting seeing the developments in the early part of this century as it kind of colonized different academic departments, and then you started to see some cultural manifestations. But it has been much more encouraging ever since, I would say, 2015, which is when I started to notice a number of first-rate people standing up and saying, there is a problem here, and we need to start doing something about it. So that's about the time when someone like Jonathan Haidt stepped up and saying, academic psychology and more broadly the social sciences have become, I don't want to put words in his mouth, they're too strong, but very bad things are happening and we need to reform the movement. And because of his stature, he then created a new institution, the Heterodox Academy, that's doing some good work. And all of that started, 9 years ago. Jordan Peterson rose to international prominence at about the same time, stepping up and saying, with respect to certain kinds of speech codes and mandated language, no, we're not going to do that. Now, Peterson is obviously much more conservative. Jonathan Haidt politically is more liberal. But I think it's important that here we have two both very courageous and people who are high in their professions standing up and saying that there is a problem there. Steven Pinker is another person I would put on the same list. And there are then any number of other people who started to do the same thing. Once we had people at that stature inside the intellectual world, but also who had a public intellectual voice, starting to say we need to do something about this. Then we started to see a whole lot of self-education going on. People who cared about education, who cared about healthcare, who cared about the art world, who cared about what's going on in the business world, getting up to speed. Well, what is this new, weird, cultural, intellectual movement that we are up against? And then they start to organize themselves and so on. So, but it took 20 to 30 years for the negative version, the bad wokeism, the bad applied postmodernism, the bad DEI to institutionalize itself and make its manifestation. And so it's only been 8, 9, 10 years for the counter movement to start getting up to speed and getting itself organized. But I'm impressed with how fast that's happened. Basically, by 4 or 5 years ago, everybody whom I think of as a decent, rational, individualistic, genuine human rights person was aware by the time COVID hit that we had a real battle on our hands. There's the whole COVID-ish set of issues that are messing things up as well, but let's leave those to the side. But once we got past COVID, now the fight really is on our hands, and I think we will win. I don't think we're past the worst of the ugliness yet and the brutality yet. I think it will be ugly and messy for a little while longer, but I think the forces of rationality and decency will prevail, and hopefully we can come out stronger with a better awareness of the bad arguments and the bad philosophies that led us down this path in the first place.
Yes, that's so interesting, and I think that a lot of the advancement that this movement and its various branches made in academia and in society at large has to do, I think, with this effacement or undermining and retreat of Judeo-Christian values. When I look at my own medical school days, I can tell you that I heard the mention of God, the biblical God, in medical school one time. That was it. It was not in a lecture. It was actually at a delivery room by a gynecologist who was delivering a baby in a cesarean section. And he was a religious Jew, and he turned to us, the medical students, kind of looking at him with awe as he was pulling this baby out. He said, now you're going to watch how the uterus is going to contract, and this I consider a divine miracle. You might look at it as a biological, evolutionary, whatever you choose to believe, but to me it is divine. And he just kind of went on about his way, and that's pretty much it. It really stuck with me decades later, remembering that event
because it was such an outlier.
Complete outlier. And I'm wondering, what are your thoughts? I mean, obviously not to push this or that religion or agenda or anything like that, but really installing the way to install objectivity back into the medicine and medical field and to the medical profession and other professions. And what do we replace this thing with? Because there has to be something to come in and replace it.
Yeah, well, I'm not at all religious. So what I would say, though, is that what we call religion, as it has been practiced in the modern world, has been a kind of hybrid form of religion, traditional Judeo-Christian religion, with much more secular Greek and Roman ways of thinking. So if you think of like old-time religion, it was explicitly about mysticism and miracles and separation of the soul and the body, and we're not allowed to do anatomy investigations, and we don't want to live a long time anyway because we want to go to heaven and so forth. So that old-time religion became under attack and largely lost the debates in the early part of in the early modern world, the 1500s, 1600s, and 1700s. But what is true is as more rational, kind of Greek and Roman inspired philosophies came to the fore, that they started then to develop more empirical scientific method, more individualistic, more life on earth matters philosophies, and they became successful. And what happened in many of the modern religions is that they tried to form an integration of the two, to say that yes, we will pay attention to science and empiricism and so forth, and we will try to integrate that or at least have a coexistence with our traditional religious views. And so I think of that as kind of modernized Judeo-Christian. And to the extent that you try to do that integration or have a hybrid, then you will have no problem with doing first-rate medicine and learning what you can from scientific method and so forth. But at the same time, there have been a huge number of people who are secular and purely naturalistic. They don't believe in God or the gods, and they have been purely naturalistic, purely scientific method, trying to extend life on Earth. So it's been a modernized religion working with modernized secular naturalistic philosophy, and then the Western world has been enormously successful on the basis of that. But what is starting to happen, though, is that to the extent that we stop believing that empiricism, rationality, individualism matter, then we start to see bursting out more irrational forms of belief systems, some of the old-fashioned kinds of religions that are much more explicitly irrationalistic, and we're starting to see more of those in the movement, and we see that same epistemology of anti-rationalism in various forms, bursting out in political form and various other cultural forms as well. So what I would say is, if you, by healthy religion, you mean a religion that is still comfortable with treating people as individuals, saying that individuals, their soul and their body matters, and I'm going to tend to the individual, and that this is a universalistic project. All individuals matter. And my project, being a medical doctor, is then to bring the best medical science to bear on treating individuals, because individuals matter and reason matters, and that fits with my religious views in a certain way. That's fine. That's great. Progress can still be made there. So, but you have to recognize that approach to religion does still require a rejection of certain forms of, I don't know if I want to say sibling religions, or at least cousin religions that are very ancient, and that they're going to be internal to your religion, battles that you will still have to fight in order to keep your approach to religion proper.
Yeah, absolutely. And that high regard for, or the utmost regard for, individualism and self-agency and self-responsibility, I think at the core of all of this, I think this is what kept the party going all this time. And God willing, we'll keep it going like that. What I was referring to, I think, about replacing one thing with another is really looking not so much as God as this arbitrary or very nebulous term, but really looking at God as a form of principle that everybody can rely on and look up to. That's something that really is, if you will, is above human nature, that guides human behavior in a mutually agreeable way that is sustainable. That is pretty much how I see this whole thing. And obviously, like you said, it cannot be something that'll divert the conversation or the or society again in a way that's collectivist and rejects individualism, or else we're headed in the same direction, just using a different kind of language, I think.
Right. No, I think that approach to religion that you are outlining is to say what we are looking for is something to ground objectively and universally our standards, our standards for knowledge and our standards for morality. And so there was a secular set of philosophies that try to do that, right, that we can get objectivity and universality by looking at the world and the way it works. There are certain objective principles that are built into the world, so to speak. And the religious version of that, though, is to say that needs to be supplemented or underwritten by some sort of godlike being. And so then there's a debate about what's the best grounding. And both of them then have the same philosophical enemies, those who will then say there is no objectivity, there is no universality, and then we're into some sort of irrational collectivist form of religion. It's my religion versus your religion, right? Or we're into some sort of irrationalist but secular philosophy, where it's my racial group or my ethnic group or just my personal subjective agenda against everybody else in the world.
Right. And ultimately, is to button this up this is ultimately a battle of faiths, a battle of deep beliefs on both sides, I'd like to think. The people engaged in DEI and the people who are standing up to DEI. I think
Mm,
this is ultimately a religious battle or a battle of faiths.
mm. Well, I don't think the word faith is the right word there, because faith, as it's used ambiguously. Sometimes by a faith, people mean just a collection of beliefs. This is my faith, I believe X, Y, and Z. But faith more consistently in the history is used as an epistemological concept. I believe in something despite the evidence or in the absence of evidence. And if by faith you mean that second one, then I would have to disagree. What I would say is we do have a battle of philosophies, right? Very deep sets of beliefs. Some of those are held in a non-rational form, and some of those are held in a rational form. And one of the core battles is over the status of rationality. Can we justify rationality as fundamental and as universal, or should we abandon rationality? And that means then we go into some pretty dark places.
Yes, yes. And Stephen Hicks, I wanted to thank you so much for coming on and having this discussion with me. And
Well, it
I
was a
hope
real pleasure. Great questions, great topic, and absolutely important topic. So, particularly since you're in the medical field, please keep fighting the good fight.
thank you, sir. Thank you so much, and see you soon.